We're returning now to our coverage of the Victorian election with more analysis as we wait for the polls to close. Live from Melbourne is Dr. Katie Allen, former federal Liberal MP. Katie, appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I understand you've been out and about at a polling booth today in Mulvane, I understand. What's the mood you've been picking up on there?
Thanks, Ash. Well, yes, I've been out there since 8 a.m. this morning. I just popped off for an hour to come in here, and the mood is very buoyant towards the Liberals, I have to say. In Malvern, I think there's really no question that Michael O'Brien, the current incumbent, will be returned in Malvern. What was surprising to me in Malvern anyway was how few how-to-vote cards for Labor were being taken. It's definitely number 2 would be the Greens, and certainly we're not seeing much love for Dan Andrews, particularly in Malvern.
More broadly, Mulvane aside, what's your expectation of the result? You're a keen political observer. Do you expect Dan Andrews will have to wrangle a minority government?
Well, I've been to a number of early voting booths across Victoria in the last, or particularly across Melbourne in the last 2 weeks, and it's very clear that this is a referendum on Dan Andrews. And so, as we know, polling can be very difficult to predict these days. But I think polling as a science has come under question, partly because the way that the market or social media and the media market is so much more fragmented, and it's very hard to predict seat by seat. So what I think we'll see is some surprising results in some seats. And I think the areas to watch in Victoria in particular in this election will be the outer east seats. I think there's pretty reasonable evidence that there's a lot of anger against Dan Andrews, and particularly the sleeper issue in this election is the COVID lockdowns, the arrogance of Dan Andrews and not explaining what he was doing and why he was doing it. And those people who did COVID hard. So there kind of seems to be the difference between, some people who didn't seem to mind COVID lockdown, and there are others who really did it hard, who lost their businesses, they might have lost their marriages, mental health issues with their children, issues that they just can't forget about. And the waiting lists for the health sector have gone through the roof. And they're angry that the arrogance of Dan Andrews with the way that he handled COVID, and they're not prepared to explain what happened and why, particularly with the quarantine fiasco and then with the terrible contact tracing and driving basically the public health response into the ground. So having to use a one-size-fits-all with regards to lockdown when people looked across the border and saw a very different response to COVID in other states. So the virus was the same across the country, but there was a very different response. And I think what we're left with here in Victoria is this massive debt issue, with more debt in Victoria than in New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania combined, which is a very bad place for the second largest state-based economy in the country to be in. But worse than that, our credit rating is taking a real hit, and that's going to have a big impact on how we pay back this massive debt that we've been saddled with. And that debt can be put at the foot of, unfortunately, a poor response, particularly a letdown in the contact tracing system, and therefore a poor response to COVID.
If those polls that you alluded to are correct and Dan Andrews is returned, what are the clear lessons here for the Liberal Party as to how the Liberals can do better next time? We all saw how some dubious candidate selections became a real distraction for Matthew Guy.
Well, I think there's a very big bridge for Matthew Guy and the Liberal team to a very big divide, of seats for the Liberals to cover, or the Liberal National Coalition to cover. I think there's 18 seats, and that's a very big ask in one term. So I think we'll be watching very carefully to see whether, this strong campaign that Matthew Guy has driven, really based on an approach which is, I'm going to do it differently, I'm going to have a different attitude. Matthew Guy has declared that he doesn't intend to hector, to talk down to people, to be arrogant in his approach, to be more consultative. And certainly he's put a lot of policy, good quality policy that's got the attention, particularly of the young voter, and certainly things like $2 public transport has really got the attention of the young voter. And I have to say, in Malvern, I did notice how many young voters were prepared to take a blue how-to-vote card, a Liberal how-to-vote card, as the only card they were taking. And so I think he's got the attention of the Liberal voters with things like investment in health, redirecting infrastructure, $32 billion into health rather than into infrastructure, his strong position on climate action with a sensible approach approach, and I think that is now resonating. So I think what's going to be very interesting is it's a big gap that he has to sort of traverse, a big gap to bridge to get to win. So I think, everyone thinks it'd be a pretty exciting outcome, but possibly unlikely because it's such a long way to go. But if he makes if he actually minimises the bridge, or what I could say is if he gets close, I think that's going to have a big impact on what people think can happen at the next election, but also that Dan Andrews is going to have to really think about the message the electorate is sending to him. So looking seat by seat, whether there's big swings in particular seats of those who are angry by what happened through COVID, we'll look to see whether there's big gains made by the Liberals and whether they make it over the line, or Liberal Nationals, whether they make it over the line. It's how big are those gains. If the gains are not very big, well, then I think we'll have to sit back, regroup and rethink. But if there are big gains made, then that gives us a pathway to understanding how to move in the direction of finally winning back government after a long time in the wilderness here in Victoria. So I think Matthew's run a very strong campaign. It's a very sensible, sound campaign. He hasn't been goaded by the Premier. Even in the recent debate, he held his cool. He said he was going to take an approach which was calm and consultative and bringing Victorians together. I think that those words were a salve to many people, and you could see that sort of arrogance coming through with Dan Andrews, even hectoring Matt Guy during the debate. So I think that people are wanting to see a new type of leadership. So if Matt doesn't actually win the premiership, I think Dan Andrews needs to listen very loud and clear to the words that are coming through from the electorate. And certainly I'm hearing from my colleagues that some of the Labor members and candidates have got very low profile in different seats because they're getting some pretty unpleasant responses from voters. And when I've been out, I've noticed people taking the how to vote card from Liberals and kind of running at the ballot box, wanting to make their views very clear that they're angry with Dan.
Well, an hour and a half until polls close there, so not long till we start to see those results rolling in. Dr. Allen, while we have you, I'm keen for your view on the story we ran just a few minutes ago about the Bell report. It was released yesterday. It found that Scott Morrison's decision to take on so many extra ministries was unnecessary and that he'd even looked at taking on a sixth portfolio. What's your reaction to the Bell report? Does Mr Morrison deserve to be censured on the floor of Parliament?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the ends never justify the means. And in my view, it's incredibly important that if you're taking steps, unconventional steps that in my view are overreach, that you should share those with the public. Scott Morrison's been unable to explain to my satisfaction why he did these things at all. I can understand in the fog of war that was COVID, in the early days, there were some decisions that were made because COVID was coming at speed. It was killing 1 in 100 people. There was a huge amount of fear. There was probably an overreaction in the early days, and it's understandable that extraordinary steps, unprecedented steps for an unprecedented historical event may have been undertaken. But then why not share those steps, if they were good governance steps, with the public and being open and transparent? That's how you engage with the trust of people. But then 18 months later, the further steps that were taken, I failed to understand why they were taken, and I would like to have a better explanation to understand them. So in my view, a democracy is a very important process of engaging, explaining to people why you're doing what you're doing. And I wrote an opinion piece about the fact that Dan Andrews in Victoria didn't allow Parliament to sit for long periods of time, even though we were sitting through the COVID pandemic in the federal Parliament. Victorian Parliament doors were closed. And my argument was, yes, that might be fine in the short term where you're trying to work out what's going on in the emergency phase of the pandemic. But once we were rolling out the vaccine, once we knew what worked to control the vaccine, and whether you agreed or not with the lockdowns, we knew how to control the virus and the pandemic, I should say. But that consent in democracy should never take a back seat once the emergency has passed. So that's where I really struggle. Is I can understand that perhaps some decisions that were made early on that were extraordinary decisions in an unprecedented historical situation, but I cannot, and I failed to understand why those steps were repeated some 18 months later, and I think we deserve an explanation to understand that better. And I've been listening closely to try and understand them, and I'm unsatisfied with the explanation at this point.
A sentiment shared by many of your former colleagues. Dr. Katie Allen, really appreciate you making the time for us today. We'll let you get back to those polling booths to shake some final hands as we edge towards those booths closing up for the evening. Thank you.